What if the oldest story we ever told wasn't the start at all? What if it was only the last sound of something much older? Under the deserts of southern Iraq, where the air hums quietly with heat, and the sand hides the color of time, pieces of clay still whisper in forgotten languages. Each mark pressed into the wet earth 5,000 years ago was meant to save a truth. But now, the truth sleeps under layers of broken ruins and silence, waiting for someone who will listen. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy the kind of stories that float between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. I'd like to imagine this silence reaching across the world. The story starts not with discovery but with dust. In the late 1800s, British and French diggers went into the plains near modern-day Uruk and Ur. Their shovels hit clay that had been hardened by hundreds of years of being forgotten. Tablets upon tablets stacked like the frozen memory of an entire people. They were called the Sumerians. And from the moment their name was spoken out loud again, something strange began to happen in our timeline. Because what they left behind wasn't the unsure writing of a newborn people. It was already complicated, measured, and deeply aware of the universe. The earliest Sumerian records appear as if from nowhere around 3500 BC. With no slow growth leading to them, their language was fully formed, their city plans perfectly lined up, their space charts already exact. They built temples, ziggurats, watering systems, and math systems that still form the bones of our calendar today. It was as if the curtain had suddenly lifted on a people that started in full bloom, then faded as strangely as it had appeared. Experts have long struggled to explain that suddenness. History prefers slow progress, gradual invention, one tool leading to the next. But the Sumerians complicate that rhythm. They spoke of a time before kings, before floods, when knowledge was given. They named their teachers not as men, but as gods coming down from the sky. And though such language was later dressed in myth, its foundation feels older than metaphor. The clay doesn't lie, it remembers. Imagine holding one of those tablets warm in your hand, its wedge-shaped marks, still carrying the touch of a hand that lived before every empire we know. The writing system, cuneiform, was not just an alphabet, but a shape of meaning. Triangles, lines, and cuts, each arranged to hold both sound and symbol. Through these marks, they recorded medicine, trade, hymns, contracts, and even star movements. One tablet lists the stages of Venus with an exactness we only confirmed with modern telescopes. Another describes the paths of Jupiter and Mars. And then there are the stories of Enki and Enlil, of Anu, of creation molded from earth and divine spirit. It's easy to dismiss mythology as invention, but when myth repeats the same pattern across continents, the silence between the lines begins to hum. The Sumerians spoke of a great flood that ended an earlier world. The same story is found in Akkadian, Hebrew, Hindu, and even Mesoamerican texts. How could cultures separated by oceans remember the same disaster? Perhaps memory itself floats like dirt, settling wherever consciousness finds room. Or perhaps the ancients shared more than we allow ourselves to imagine. When diggers uncovered the city of Uruk, they expected crude beginnings. Instead, they found city walls stretching 6 miles, huge temples lined up with space points, and proof of advanced metalworking. Buried beneath one ziggurat, they dug up a library of over 40,000 clay tablets, a people that documented itself in amazing detail, yet left us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their mathematics based on 60 not 10 come from? Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity as though they were remembering rather than discovering? Some researchers suggest that Sumer came from centuries of forgotten development, a line of small settlements lost to wearing away and flood. Others whisper that the Sumerians received their knowledge from an even earlier people, one erased by the disasters that ended the last ice age. And then there are those who read the tablets word for word, that the gods who came down from the sky were not divine in the spiritual sense, but teachers, travelers, or perhaps leftovers of a people that came before us altogether. But even the doubters admit something strange. The Sumerian timeline doesn't fit. Peoples aren't supposed to appear fully structured, yet here they did. Farming, writing, law, music, medicine, all at once. The clay tablets don't show trial and error. They show improvement, as though what we call the birth of civilization was to them a rebuilding. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. The markings on its surface describe the building of a temple in honor of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But among the dedication lines, one sentence stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, a word that means memory, not invention. It's a quiet confession that even the Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to something older. Sometimes when you look closely at these objects, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried. The print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago, a pulse frozen in mud. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have written down the last surviving pieces of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps on purpose. The silence between those lines feels heavy, as if something huge had been taken away. The same way a missing note can haunt an entire song. The same way a lost memory hovers at the edge of sleep. Maybe that's why these stories still whisper to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the part that survived the burning. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding. But maybe we are the last chapter of remembering. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another 1,000 years, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. If the Sumerians were not the first, then who are they remembering? They said kingship came down from heaven. Not symbolically, not in a roundabout way, but as a statement of fact. That single line carved into clay more than 4,000 years ago still shakes with something that language struggles to contain. After the kingship came down from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. It is the opening verse of what we now call the Sumerian king list, a record of rulers whose reigns stretch far beyond the limits of human possibility. On the surface, it reads like a history document, cities, names, dates. But as the list continues, the numbers become impossible. One king ruled for 36,000 years, another for 28,000, another for 43,200. In total, 8 rulers governed the world before a great flood swept over the land. Only after that flood does the record shrink into something more human. Reigns of hundreds, then decades. Experts have tried for centuries to decode what those impossible numbers mean. Were they symbolic, about space, teaching a lesson? Or were they preserving a time when the scale of life itself was different? There's something unsettling in that question, something that makes the air around these tablets feel heavier. Because these weren't idle stories, they were business records written in the same hand that counted grain, debts, and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this list was memory, not myth. And that difference haunts everything about it. The earliest copies were found in the ruins of Larsa and Nippur. Each version differs slightly, as though translated from a memory that was already fading. Yet the structure remains the same. 8 kings before the flood. Their reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, followed by a universal reset. Then new kings arise. Uruk, Kish, each claiming divine right, each tracing rightness back to that pre-flood age. Some historians argue that these numbers reflect moon cycles or perhaps a symbolic calendar meant to show divine authority. But others, those who stay too long on the strange exactness of Sumerian mathematics, notice that the numbers match multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian unit known as the sar. This wasn't random. It was the same system used to measure orbits, star cycles, and distances. Why would a royal record be written in space notation? Unless the kings themselves were meant to be read as heavenly beings, rulers of ages rather than years. The king list is one of those objects that feels like it shouldn't exist. It bridges myth and history so smoothly that experts still argue over which side it belongs to. The names of these ancient rulers, Alulim, Alanger, and Menluana, don't appear anywhere else. And yet, the cities they ruled do. Eridu, for instance, is real. considered by diggers to be the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. Under its ruins, they found layer upon layer of construction dating back almost 8,000 years. Temples rebuilt upon older temples, each one slightly smaller than the one before, as if copying the slow shrinking of time itself. The Sumerians called Eridu the first city. In their stories, it was founded by the god Enki, the keeper of knowledge, the one who shaped humanity from clay. Digging there reveals proof of a complicated water system, ritual altars and objects made of materials that shouldn't have existed in that region. Stones from distant mountains, shells from the Indian Ocean, a trade network or a leftover of something older, perhaps both. When the king list describes the flood that ended the reigns of the ancient kings, it uses language strangely similar to later texts. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no divine judgment, just an event that resets time. Beneath UR, diggers in the 1920s uncovered a layer of clean, empty dirt nearly 2 meters thick. Proof of a massive flood around 2900 BC. It buried everything beneath it, sealing one age beneath another. It is tempting to read this as proof, though proof is never what these stories truly offer. They offer suggestion, shadow, memory. In the quiet of a museum, standing before the king list tablet, you might notice how careful each wedge mark is. There's no hesitation. Whoever wrote it believed in the exactness of every number. And yet it feels as though the writer was copying something even older, something handed down through generations that no longer understood its beginning. The strangeness deepens when you realize that nearly every ancient culture shares an echo of this same order. Divine rulers, huge flood, new beginning. The Egyptian Turin papyrus lists gods and demigods ruling before human pharaohs. The Hindu Puranas describe vast yugas, ages lasting tens of thousands of years ending in flood and fire. The Mayan Chilam Balam speaks of earlier worlds destroyed by water and time. Always the same pattern. Rule from the sky, a fall into chaos, rebirth through flood. It's as though humanity remembers the rhythm but not the melody. The details change, the names shift. Yet the structure remains, a half-remembered dream repeated across continents. Some researchers like Zakaria Sitchin argued that the king list preserves a record of beings who weren't entirely human. Those who came from the stars taught humanity and ruled until the flood removed them. His understandings, though debated, found response because the questions the tablets raise refuse to die. Even traditional diggers, while rejecting the alien idea, admit that the beginning of Sumerian civilization is strange, a spark without a match. Others see in the list a hidden scientific calendar. The long reigns may represent precession cycles or cosmic ages. If the reign of Al-Yalim lasted 28,800 years, perhaps it marked a heavenly alignment, a rhythm of the heavens copied on earth. The Sumerians often blurred the boundaries between sky and soil. Their gods were the planets themselves, their myths the language of orbit and light. Maybe the king list was less a record of rule and more a map of universal order, a record of the time before time. Still, the emotional weight of it cannot be ignored. Beneath all the numbers and theories, there is sadness in these tablets, a sense that something wonderful once existed, and that everything after was merely its shadow. When the flood swept over, the old world died and memory became myth. The Sumerians built their temples as acts of remembering, not ambition. They were rebuilding, not beginning. You can almost hear that longing in their hymns, songs to gods who no longer answered, prayers to ancestors turned to dust. The king list might have been less a document of power than a prayer, a way to hold onto a world they could no longer see, a world that perhaps they themselves did not fully understand. In one of the surviving lines, after the flood, the text reads simply, "Then kingship was again lowered from heaven." As if history itself is circular, coming down and pulling back like the tide. Each age, each people, each rise and fall, just another attempt to remember what was lost the first time. Perhaps that's why we still search the desert for their traces. Not to find answers, but to feel that rhythm again, the slow pulse of a world older than history. If time began once before, could it begin again? There is a quiet kind of wonder that comes from realizing how much the ancients knew about the sky. Not as something unclear, not as a picture of wonder, but as a system they seem to have already mapped long before telescopes existed. The Sumerians didn't just look upward. They measured, recorded, and lined up their world according to what they saw. Their temples were built in exact direction with space paths. Their gods were the planets. Their calendar followed the complicated rhythms of Venus and Jupiter with an exactness we would only rediscover thousands of years later. And somehow this knowledge appeared not at the end of a long learning curve but at the very beginning. If you walk among the ruins of Uar or Nippur and stand where the ziggurats once reached toward the horizon, the shape of their foundations reveals something strange. Every major temple faces a space point. The rising of a particular star, the solstice line, the place where Venus appears at dawn. The great ziggurat of Uar, for example, is lined up almost perfectly to the north with corners facing the main directions. A feat of building awareness that means both math skill and space watching. Yet these structures were built nearly 6,000 years ago at a time when most of the world still lived in scattered tribes. Among the thousands of tablets dug up from Mesopotamia, a small group records something unexpected: organized star charts, the so-called Emuel.Apin tablets believed to date from the Old Babylonian period, but keeping far older Sumerian knowledge, list constellations, equinoxes, solstices, and the rising and setting times of the planets. Some experts believe the observations written there could date back to around 3000 BC, possibly earlier. How could they know the exact cycle of Venus? 584.92 days, with an error margin of less than a single day. Modern science with all its instruments calculates the precession of the equinox at roughly 1 degree every 72 years. But in ancient Sumer, writings already show an understanding of this slow drift of the stars. To measure that, one would need centuries of continuous watching or received records from a people that had already observed them. The Sumerians left us neither telescopes nor formal explanations, only myth, but their myths speak in the language of data. The goddess Inanna associated with Venus was said to go down into the underworld and rise again. Her story copying the planet's disappearance and reappearance in the sky. The god Nanna, the moon, was the keeper of cycles, his temple, the great observatory of Uar. The 7 great gods matched the 7 classical planets. Even the term Anunnaki, often translated as those who from heaven to earth came, carries a double meaning. Mythological beings, yes, but also the counted ones of Anu, a phrase that in Sumerian also means the numbered heavenly bodies. It is tempting to read too much into coincidence. Yet the steadiness of these patterns across cities and ages suggests purpose, not accident. Each temple, each ritual, each festival date showed the turning of the heavens. They didn't separate religion from science or myth from observation. For them, the universe was a single breathing system, its motion sacred, its numbers divine. But where did this awareness begin? Did a people just coming out of the Stone Age truly develop such refined space science alone? In 1899, the German digger Hugo Winkler uncovered tablets at Bagazkoy in Anatolia, texts that linked Sumerian star law to the later Hittites and Chaldeans. What's striking is the continuity, the same constellations, the same patterns of planet worship passed down for thousands of years with barely any change. Such exactness doesn't usually survive word-of-mouth tradition. It survives through written record or preserved systems of instruction. Which means the Sumerians were not inventing astronomy. They were documenting something already known. In one tablet from Nineveh's library, now kept in the British Museum, a scribe had carefully drawn the path of Jupiter across the night sky using a complicated math system that modern space scientists recognized as a basic form of calculus. Another tablet describes the shadow of the Earth across the moon during an eclipse, noting that the god is eaten but returns. Beneath the poetry lies recognition of orbit and shape. And when these same scribes referred to the heavens as the tablets of destiny, they weren't being poetic. They were speaking the actual truth of their worldview that the stars recorded fate. There's something almost scary in that. A people born out of mud and reed huts whose farmers depended on the flooding of rivers, writing about the mathematical exactness of the universe as if they had already mastered it. And maybe in a sense they had. Some researchers see in their 60-based numbering system a reflection of the 12 major constellations of the zodiac, the division of the sky that we still use today. Others point to the Sumerian focus on the number 60 found everywhere in their measurements as proof of space encoding. 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 360 degrees. Even our modern clocks still echo their design. The very rhythm of our timekeeping is received from theirs. And then there are the stories that unsettle even the most careful experts. In a series of tablets from Sapar, the god Enki instructs humankind in the measures of the heavens, teaching them to build instruments to see that which cannot be seen. Another piece describes a chamber of glass that makes the eyes bigger. Some understand this as metaphor, others as lost technology, a poetic memory of lenses or early telescopes. Indeed, small rock crystal lenses have been found in Mesopotamian sites, though their purpose remains debated. Were they decorations or tools of observation? The more we read, the harder it becomes to separate their belief system from ours. The Sumerians didn't just watch the sky. They believed it was alive. Each planet had a will, a personality, an orbit that copied moral order. The movement of the stars was not mechanical but spiritual. Yet their records of it remain mathematically steady. Somehow they managed to hold myth and measurement in the same breath without conflict. Maybe that's what modern times lost. The ability to see exactness and wonder as one thing. If we could ask a Sumerian priest space scientist how he knew what he knew, he might simply say it was given. And perhaps he would not mean by gods of flesh or fire, but by the universe itself, something received through observation, ritual, patience, and memory. Yet even that explanation leaves something unspoken, because their knowledge feels too huge for their setting, too careful for mere chance. Was this the leftover of a forgotten age, a gift from people who had already charted the heavens before the flood? Or is it simply proof that humanity's brilliance has always been older than we imagine? Either way, when the sun sets over the ruins of Ur and the first stars light up over the desert, it's easy to believe the Sumerians are still watching. Their shape remains, carved into the earth. The angles of their temples still catch the light of the same stars they once recorded. Their myths still move with the rhythm of planetary orbits. And somewhere in that rhythm lies a memory of a time when science and divinity were the same language. The gods who measured the heavens may have been only men. Or perhaps the men who watched the heavens became gods in the act of measuring. If they received their knowledge, then from whom? Among the broken foundations of ancient Sumer, between pieces of brick and burned clay, diggers have found something quietly amazing. Proof of technology that should not exist at the dawn of civilization. Tools of bronze appearing before the Bronze Age. Perfectly shaped drilling on diorite stone. Clay tablets describing complicated mixtures of minerals and metals. Even the very word they used for knowledge, did not mean learning in the way we understand it. It meant something closer to codes, formulas, or basic laws of order. To the Sumerians, science was not invention. It was memory. When the digging at Eridu and Ur uncovered tablets detailing the building of ziggurats, researchers expected early blueprints, rough sketches of mud and reed structures. Instead, they found measurements, balanced ratios, and angles described in base 60 mathematics, the same system we still use to measure circles and time. Their builders calculated volumes, slopes, and weight spread with scary exactness, suggesting a practical understanding of shape hundreds of years before the Greeks would give it a name. It is as if they had received an engineer's handbook from a disappeared source, one they could follow, but perhaps no longer fully explain. Even in daily life, their scientific awareness was woven into everything. Farmers recorded the stages of the moon to predict watering cycles. Doctors listed symptoms and treatments on tablets that read like early medicine. One tablet from Nippur lists over 200 healing plants sorted by function. Another describes the mixing of sulfur, copper, and oil to create compounds used in rituals of cleaning, formulas that look like early chemistry. There are even mentions of something called nigger, translated as the shining liquid, which some think refers to distilled mercury, though such a material should not have been known in that age. These echoes of forgotten science grow louder the deeper one looks. Take metalworking. By 3000 BC, Sumerians were melting copper and trying out alloys. Yet in the ruins of Tel Asmar and Kish, Metalworkers have found traces of hardened bronze that come before this timeline. Metal that suggests an earlier, more advanced understanding of melting. In the same region, cylinder seals show saws, drills, and bellows. It is not proof of machines as we know them, but it means that their craftsmanship reached a level of skill unexplained by the tools diggers have recovered. Then there is mathematics itself, the language of their world. The base 60 system they used allowed fractions, space divisions, and calculations of time far beyond the needs of simple farming. To divide the heavens into 360 degrees, to measure an hour into 60 minutes, demands not imagination but history. Some historians argue that their system must have grown from long observation, perhaps over thousands of years. Others whisper that such exactness arrived ready-made, the leftover of an earlier age. A few experts have gone further still. In the 1920s, the expert George Rui suggested that Sumerian technical vocabulary contained loan words from a non-Semitic unknown language, traces of a dead scientific word list. He called it the substrate of invention. We do not know who spoke it, only that its leftovers survive like fossils buried within Sumerian speech. Perhaps those words belong to the very people the Sumerians claim to remember, the one before the flood. To modern ears, this sounds like making myths, but myth has a strange habit of preserving technical truth in symbolic form. Consider the god Enki, lord of the deep waters and keeper of wisdom. In the myth of Enki and Inanna, he sends the me of civilization, a series of tablets containing the codes for music, building, law, and crafts. Each me is a principle, a formula. When Inanna carries them to her city, civilization itself awakens. The story is spiritual but also strangely word for word. It describes the transmission of knowledge as if from an older source to a younger one. The gods are not inventors. They are caretakers. That word caretaker may hold the key. The Sumerians never claimed ownership of their sciences. They described themselves as receivers, stewards of gifts from heaven. Their scribes learned shape and space science not as human achievements but as divine gift. And in their rituals to teach or speak knowledge was to redo creation itself. A reminder that wisdom must be kept, not invented. We might be tempted to see their science as accidental brilliance, a coincidence of clever farmers and watching priests. Yet there are details that resist simplicity. In 1936, diggers dug up a clay tablet from Sippar containing a list of shape problems that included the calculation of a right-angled triangle using what would later be known as the Pythagorean theorem. These are not the fumblings of a beginning mind. They are the leftovers of a system already improved. Even their art hides mathematical secrets. The sizes of their statues often followed harmonic ratios, the same balanced systems later celebrated in classical Greek sculpture. The temples of Uruk and Eridu are constructed on scales of 3-4-5, the simplest form of right-angle proportion. It is as though they understood that beauty, structure, and sound were all showings of the same universal pattern. The echo stretched beyond Mesopotamia. Around the same centuries across the sea, the builders of Egypt's earliest temples were using similar measurements. In the Indus Valley, city plans followed strict shape grids. In each region, the earliest stage of civilization appears not crude but careful, as if responding to a memory that went beyond geography. Experts call this the synchronization problem, the unlikely at the same time-ness of complicated urban design around 3000 BC. Why did humanity begin building with mathematical consciousness all at once? Why not earlier or later? Some argue that this reflects a shared awakening of the human mind, a line crossed when language, observation, and symbolic thought came together. Others sense in it the leftover of something that came before, a common gift scattered and remembered differently by each culture. Perhaps it was not that Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley discovered civilization separately, but that they each rediscovered pieces of an older blueprint. The Sumerians themselves seem to believe that in their hymns, the first city, Eridu, is described as raised from the clay of the deep, its foundations older than the sky. The god Enki's temple there, the Abzu, was said to sit above the waters of wisdom that flowed from the underworld. Metaphor, yes, but also an image of continuity, knowledge surfacing from the depths of time. Even their mythology of sound carries echoes of scientific order. The word Enlil, often translated as Lord of the Air, can also mean the vibration that moves through space. In ritual chants, priests called on him as the breath that shapes the world, the invisible force that structures matter. To modern ears, it sounds strangely like a poetic understanding of frequency and resonance, the physics of vibration written in sacred language. If these parallels are coincidence, they are deep ones. And yet, coincidence or not, the impression remains that the earliest people we know was not struggling toward knowledge, but struggling to remember it. Each equation, each temple, each tablet feels like an echo, a sound wave from something older. We live surrounded by the leftovers of their systems. Every time we tell time, every time we divide a circle, every time we measure, we are repeating the logic of their world. They are still teaching us, though their names have crumbled to dust. Perhaps civilization doesn't begin when we invent knowledge. Perhaps it begins when we rediscover it, when the silence of forgetting breaks and an echo returns. But if Sumer remembered what had come before, what disaster had erased the world they were trying so carefully to rebuild? If one listens long enough, even clay begins to speak, buried beneath centuries of wind and silence. The tablets of Nippur and Nineveh form what might be the oldest libraries in human history, collections of law, medicine, space science, and ritual. Yet they are more than collections of knowledge. They are the frozen memory of a people that seemed desperate to keep what it knew. When these tablets were first dug up, they broke the idea that ancient people lived in ignorance. Instead, they showed a world of scribes, experts, and thinkers who wrote as if they were racing against disappearing. The city of Nippur was not a royal capital. It had no king, no armies, no empire. And yet it was the spiritual heart of Sumer, home to the great temple of Enlil, the Lord of the Wind. Beneath its ruins, diggers uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, an ancient collection so huge that experts are still figuring out pieces today. What they found changed everything. There were business lists, yes, but also poems, star maps, surgery instructions, even thinking reflections on fate and justice. Some of these texts come before the Bible by more than 1,000 years, yet they contain thoughts so familiar that they feel almost modern. Imagine standing in one of those rooms, the air thick with the smell of baked clay. Rows upon rows of tablets line the shelves, each one pressed with the angled marks of cuneiform, each one a voice kept. The scribes of Nippur were not mere record keepers. They were guardians of continuity. In their schools, young students learned not only to read and write, but to memorize entire lists of signs, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. Learning to write in Sumer was an initiation into a secret order, an act of devotion as much as intellect. The clay tablet was their sacred object, their bridge to the past. The huge range of subjects kept there is staggering. One tablet details a code of rules for doctors. Do not cause harm by your hand. Do not hold back the cure. Another describes the structure of the liver in the practice of fortune-telling, an early observation of anatomy written in ritual language. Others list mineral substances used in dyes and medicines. Even more surprising are the space records, the risings of stars, the movements of the moon, and the prediction of eclipses. For a people we call the first, their thinking horizon was already huge. When the great flood of history finally drowned Sumer's cities through war, wearing away, and time, Nippur's tablets survived because they were clay. Fire and burial kept them where papyrus and parchment would have turned to dust. And so, thousands of years later, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam began to dig at Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they stumbled upon something even greater. The library of Ashurbanipal, a king of Assyria. That library, though built more than 1,000 years after Nippur's golden age, was its heir. Within its walls, the Assyrian scribes had gathered and copied Sumerian and Babylonian texts, over 30,000 tablets in total. When the palace burned, the heat hardened them into permanence. The result was a collection of universal scope, keeping stories, calculations, and prayers that would otherwise have vanished forever. Among them were pieces of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story that came before Genesis. There were omens, star lists, dream guides, hymns to Inanna and Enki, and lists of kings stretching back into myth. Reading those tablets now, one feels a strange mixture of thanks and sadness. Thanks that the fire saved them. Sadness that the people they recorded was already fading when the copies were made. The scribes of Nineveh worked like diggers of their own past, keeping texts they themselves could barely understand. One colophon reads, "From the old tablets, damaged, restored with care." Another tablet bears the quiet signature of a scribe. "I have written what was left to me." Those words echo across the centuries like a sad song. They knew they were writing at the end of something. The content of these libraries hints at a thinking line that challenges simple sorting. In the Enuma Anu in Lil, thousands of lines devoted to heavenly omens, each movement of a planet, each ring around the moon was recorded and understood as a reflection of divine will. Behind the poetry, however, lies organized observation, data covering generations. The Sumerians and their heirs were scientists in priestly robes, mathematicians speaking in myth. They didn't separate the physical from the sacred. For them to measure the heavens was to talk with the gods. One of the most haunting discoveries in Nineveh's collection is the so-called Tablet of the Great Flood. It tells of a man chosen to survive the huge flood, commanded by a god to build a vessel and keep life. The parallels to Noah's story are unmistakable, but this version is older, perhaps the original. The flood, it says, swept over like a wind, erasing kings and cities alike. When the waters pulled back, kingship came down again from heaven. The cycle started again. The story is both myth and record, memory and metaphor. It is easy to read these texts as distant curiosities, but they were not written for us. They were written for continuity, for a future they hoped would still understand. Each tablet was a time capsule, a plea against erasure. The scribes must have known that empires fall and tongues vanish. They wrote anyway, trusting clay more than stone. And perhaps they were right, because long after their cities collapsed, their words endure. Their numbers define our clocks. Their shape forms our buildings. Their myths live in our religions. Even their fears of flood, of forgetting remain ours. Every modern library is in a sense a descendant of Nippur and Nineveh. Each shelf a new layer of clay. But there's another layer to this story, one rarely spoken out loud. Some pieces from these ancient libraries describe devices, instruments, and processes that seem out of place in their time. One tablet speaks of a vessel of shining copper that stores the fire of heaven. Another mentions crystal that brings light to darkness. Experts understand these as metaphors for ritual objects. Yet one wonders, were they metaphors or faint echoes of lost technologies whose purposes we can no longer imagine? Even their writing system feels like a machine of keeping. Cuneiform could record both sound and idea, a mixed code that could survive translation. It was strong, adaptable, modular. When the Greeks later adopted the concept of the written collection, they did so under the shadow of Nineveh's example. The library as an idea began in Sumer. Standing before those tablets today under the clean light of museums, it is difficult not to feel the pull of that ancient purpose to remember. They knew knowledge could vanish. They saw it happen before. Perhaps that's why they wrote so focused, so completely. Every wedge in clay was an act of fighting against the flood. But if the Sumerians and their heirs were merely keeping what they already knew, what then had they lost? What deeper collection lies still buried beneath the layers of time, waiting for another people to find it, to read, to wonder, and to ask the same unanswerable question? In the oldest stories ever written, humanity is not born. It is made. The Sumerians told of gods who worked to shape the world and of a moment when they grew tired of their endless work. It was then they said that Enki, the god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the lady of life, gathered the spirit of the divine and mixed it with the clay of the earth. From this mixing came the first humans, Lulu Amalu, servants who could bear the burdens of creation. It is a tale half myth, half memory. Yet behind its poetry hides something more. An idea so ancient and so bold that it still unsettles us. That life itself may be the result of design. The Atrahasis epic carved into tablets long before the book of Genesis describes the gods meeting. In Lil, their leader, complains about the noise of the lesser beings who work in the fields. Enki offers a solution. They will fashion a new race to work in their place. But the raw clay alone is lifeless. To bring it alive, they need something of themselves. So they sacrifice a god. His blood mixed with the earth, his spirit divided among humankind. And thus through an act of divine rule-breaking, we are born both mortal and sacred, both servant and heir. It is an origin that feels older than any religion, part biology, part mystery. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? Did they imagine this story as pure teaching story? Or were they recording something remembered from a time so far removed that it could only survive in mythic form? Diggers have long treated such tales as metaphors for the dawn of civilization, the moment when humanity learned farming, law, and writing. But what if the story's deeper meaning is word for word in ways we can no longer see? The phrase mixed with the blood of the gods appears again and again across Mesopotamian texts. In Akkadian texts like Enuma Elish, the genetic spirit of the divine was described as a life-bearing fluid, a seed of heaven. The same idea echoes in Egypt, in Greece, in the Hebrew Bible. The human body, they believed, carried pieces of something older, something heavenly. Modern readers tend to separate myth from science. Yet when one looks closely, the distance between them narrows. The Sumerians described a process of creation that involves the handling of flesh and blood, matter filled with intention. In the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the gods try repeatedly, creating beings that fail, one blind, one mute, one unable to reproduce, until finally they succeed. The story reads like an ancient teaching story of trial and error, a poetic reflection of some forgotten knowledge of human body parts or heredity. Perhaps not word for word trying, but a symbol of that haunting gut feeling that life is the product of order, of design. Experts who studied the Sumerian collection note how often their texts speak of templates, the me, as blueprints for both physical and moral reality. Every element of existence from kingship to weaving to fertility was said to have its own me, a divine formula that kept the universe in balance. To have the me was to have the power of creation itself. When Inanna stole these tablets from Enki, chaos spread through the world, not because she went against the gods, but because she messed up the code that kept life going. The language of myth begins to sound almost like computers, as though the ancients saw reality as a system governed by hidden instructions. In another broken text, the god Enki tells his priests to guard the blood that makes the clay speak. That line, mysterious and strange, stays like an echo of biological truth. Blood indeed carries language of its own. DNA, the molecular code that decides life's form. Could it be that what we read as divine metaphor once described an ancient understanding, one lost through time, not knowledge of molecules or genetics as we know them, but a gut-level awareness that life structure lives within blood, within pattern? Of course, such guessing unsettles historians. Yet, it is impossible to ignore the pattern. Peoples across the ancient world share this same imagery. The mixing of heaven and earth. The creation of man from divine matter. The Egyptians said humanity was formed from the tears of Ra. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus shaping man from clay. The Hebrews echoed Sumer almost word for word. God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nose the breath of life. The story moved, changed, survived, but its core remained. The mingling of dust and spirit, matter and code. What does it mean that the oldest written people begins with such a story? Perhaps it was simply a way to explain consciousness, to make peace with the human desire for purpose with the reality of hard work. Or perhaps it was a memory handed down through floods and ruins, a recollection of a time when beings older than us walked the earth. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens. In later Babylonian texts, these gods were said to teach humanity, farming, space science, and metalworking. To others, they are mythic symbols. To some, they are the forgotten teachers of early history. In one hymn from Nippur, the poet writes, "Praise who mixed the spirit of heaven with the clay of the Abzu, who gave to man the image of the gods." The phrase image of the gods, Salmuelani, carries the same sound as the later Hebrew Tselem Elohim. Could the Sumerian idea of divine image have been the original seed from which that later concept grew? The parallels are too exact to dismiss as coincidence. What we call religion may at its roots be the language of remembering. There is also the returning symbol of the tree, the sacred line linking heaven, earth, and the underworld. On many Sumerian seals, figures stand beside a styled tree flanked by winged beings offering vessels of water or life. The picture repeats from Mesopotamia to Persia to Egypt, even to the Indus Valley. Some understand it as the tree of life, others as a genetic symbol, a symbol of family line. Either way, it represents continuity, a bridge between divine and mortal. Perhaps that is what the blood of the gods truly meant, a metaphor for consciousness itself, the spark that connects flesh to forever. And yet, there is sadness in this myth. For the same gods who created humanity also cursed them with death. To be made from divine blood was to contain divinity, but also to be forever cut off from it. The story of Enki's creation is one of both gift and exile. We are children of the divine and prisoners of matter. Every Sumerian prayer, every sad song carries that tone of wanting for return, for reunion, for remembering. If their myths were indeed memories, then perhaps they were mourning a separation that once happened, a fall not of sin, but of knowledge. Something was divided long ago, and ever since we have tried to piece it back together. Each age rediscovers pieces, the laws of physics, the secrets of life, and calls it progress. But maybe it is only recollection. In the end, the Sumerians saw no conflict between creation and science, between gods and clay. They saw only one story endlessly retold. The universe awakening to itself through the vessel of flesh. The blood of the gods flows in us still, they would have said, not as a myth, but as a reminder that our beginnings are both earthly and universal, both known and forgotten. If the first humans were born from the mingling of heaven and earth, what happens when the blood of the gods remembers what it once was? There is a strange quiet that follows disaster, a silence so complete that even memory hesitates to speak. The Sumerians knew that silence well. They called it the day the waters swept over the land. To them, it was not merely a storm or a flood. It was the eraser of a world, the cleansing of an age that had grown too loud, too full of its own creations. What remained after was not just ruin, but memory loss. Humanity began again, they said, smaller, humbler, haunted by echoes of what came before. In the Epic of Zasidra, one of the earliest flood stories known to humankind, the story unfolds in pieces carved into clay sometime around 1700 BC, but rooted in far older spoken memory. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise, decide destruction. Only Zasidra, a king and priest of the city of Shuruppak, receives a whisper of warning from the god Enki. Build a vessel, Enki tells him, of strong walls and sealed pitch. Take into it the seed of all living things. Then the rain begins, not gentle but endless. The rivers rise, the sea swallows the plains, and the horizon dissolves into water. For 7 days and nights, the world vanishes beneath the flood. When the waters pull back, Zasidra opens a window and releases a dove. It does not return. He knows the earth has appeared again. In thanks, he offers sacrifice. The gods moved or perhaps sorry grant him forever life and place him in the land beyond the rivers. This story comes before the biblical flood by over 1,000 years. Its bones are the same. Divine anger, chosen survivor, vessel of life, renewal. Yet the Sumerian version carries no moral lesson, no blame. It reads instead like a geological memory, a record of an event so deep that it burned itself into the human timeline. Digging, careful as ever, hesitates to confirm such myths. And yet, beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, there is proof that something like the Sumerian flood did happen. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley dug at UR and discovered a deep, empty layer of dirt, clean river mud nearly 2 meters thick sandwiched between layers of living spaces. He found similar deposits at Kish and Shuruppak. The dating matched roughly to 2900 BC. Woolley described it simply, a flood of such size that it destroyed life and left the land empty. The people who rebuilt afterward did so as if they were starting anew. To modern minds, it may sound like coincidence, one local disaster among many. But to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, swollen by rains and melting snows, may have combined with tidal surges from the Persian Gulf. Or perhaps the memory reaches even farther back to the violent end of the last ice age when meltwater floods reshaped entire continents. In every corner of the ancient world, the same pattern continues. Myths of great waters, survivors in boats, the rebirth of humankind. From India's Manu to the Greek Deucalion, from the Aztec Coxcox to the biblical Noah, the story repeats like a scar in the shared mind. The Sumerians, though, described it not merely as disaster but as transition. The flood was the dividing line between the antediluvian kings, those mysterious rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the mortal kings who came after. It was the veil between myth and history. Before the flood, the gods walked openly among men. Afterward, they pulled back. The connection between heaven and earth was cut. Humanity was left to remember and to misremember. Some tablets hint that the flood was not entirely natural. In one piece, the gods debate among themselves. Should humankind be destroyed? Enlil, weary of the noise of cities, argues for destruction. Enki pleads for mercy, seeking another way. It is a talk of opposing forces, order and compassion, control and chaos. When the huge flood comes, it feels less like accident and more like decision. The phrase used to describe it, the Great Decree, suggests purpose. The flood was not just water, it was judgment. Others have seen in this story traces of something even more complicated, a metaphor for cycles of civilization. Perhaps the flood was not a word-for-word flood, but a symbolic description of an event that reset human culture. A comet impact, a shift in climate, a collapse of knowledge. Geological proof hints at sudden sea level rises and space impacts near the end of the Pleistocene. To the survivors, it would have seemed divine punishment, unexplainable power. And so they remembered it as a cleansing, one that washed away both sin and science. If the flood erased a former world, then every object the Sumerians later buried was a piece of that forgotten age. Their writing, their mathematics, their star charts. Each feels like an attempt to get back something half-remembered. They were not inventing civilization. They were rebuilding after the water. Even their myths read like recovery guides. The god Enki, savior of humanity, teaches the survivors how to plant, how to measure, how to keep time. Knowledge in their view was not discovery but putting back together. In the poem, The Return of Inanna, the goddess goes down to the underworld and rises again after 3 days, bringing fertility back to the land. The Sumerians may have seen the flood in similar terms, going down into chaos, return to life. Yet beneath the spiritual teaching story lingers a geological memory. Something happened, something huge enough to break both land and legend. There is a line from the Epic of Gilgamesh that feels almost like confession. Napishtim, the flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh, "What you call the gods were once men of great name. They remembered the secrets of the deep." It is a strange sentence, one that suggests that divinity and humanity are not separate species, but states of memory. The flood did not just drown the earth, it drowned that memory. What remained was the echo. Even today, when rain falls over the plains of southern Iraq, it is said that the soil releases a faint metallic smell, as though the ground itself recalls the sea that once covered it. In that smell lies the leftover of the ancient disaster, the flood that ended an era and began another. And perhaps the Sumerians sense that such cycles never truly end. Every people, no matter how advanced, eventually meets its flood, whether of water, fire, or forgetfulness. To the ancients, survival was not victory. It was responsibility. Ziusadra was not rewarded with paradise, but exile, sent to dwell in the distance, to remember what others would forget. The flood was both punishment and keeping, ensuring that at least one thread of memory would remain. That thread wound its way into every myth that followed, binding the ages together like layers of story. When the Sumerians wrote of the huge flood, they weren't warning us. They were reminding themselves that the gods, or perhaps nature itself, always demands silence after too much noise. And in that silence, humanity must learn again how to begin. If every age is washed away to make room for the next, then what will be the flood that erases us? And who will be left to remember what we once knew? Sometimes what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in pieces scattered across the world. They called such leftovers shuba, meaning pieces of the whole. To them, these pieces were more than old objects. They were the fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters. And as centuries passed, each new discovery dug up in the soil of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the mountains beyond seemed to whisper the same unsettling message. Something had existed before them, something both huge and forgotten. When explorers first began digging up ancient sites across the Near East in the 1800s, they were not only finding cities, they were finding odd things, objects that did not belong to their assigned ages, technologies that seemed misplaced, objects whose beginnings no one could explain. In the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, they found gears carved into stone, lenses ground from quartz, and sculptures showing figures in complicated robes patterned with symbols that did not match any known writing system. Most of these finds were quietly removed to museum vaults, labeled as curiosities or mistakes. Yet a few, just a few, found their way into the books of digging, sparking debates that have never truly ended. In the 1930s, reports came out of a small egg-shaped object dug up near Baghdad made of terracotta and capped with a copper cylinder. It seemed to contain traces of acid wearing away. Some researchers proposed it could generate an electric charge, an early battery 2,000 years older than it should have been. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a vessel of ritual or storage. But the possibility remains that the ancients may have known ways to control forces we only rediscovered thousands of years later. Even now, it sits behind glass in the Baghdad Museum, its function unclear, its silence heavier than explanation. There are other whispers in Turkey's Anatolian highlands. Far from Sumer, a site called Göbekli Tepe reveals huge stone pillars carved with animals and space symbols more than 11,000 years old, 6,000 years before Sumer's rise. The site comes before farming. Yet, its builders arranged stones weighing tons into shape enclosures lined up with the stars. No writing, no metal, no cities, yet an understanding of space science and engineering that seems out of place. Diggers call it the first temple. But to the Sumerians, who appeared long after, such a site would have been described another way, a leftover from before the flood. And in the caves of northern Iraq at Shanidar, skeletons have been found buried with flowers, proof of ritual, of consciousness, stretching back to the Neanderthals. The layers of humanity overlap here like layers of time, each one keeping a different kind of knowledge. The deeper the dig, the older the skill becomes. It is as if civilization did not climb a ladder but floated in waves rising, drowning, resurfacing. Among Sumerian experts, there has always stayed a theory unspoken but continuing that their civilization's sudden appearance was not sudden but received. Their myths say as much. After the flood, Enki gives to the survivors the black-headed people the tools of life, writing, measurement, farming, and law. He does not invent these things. He puts them back. The very language of Sumer hints at this putting back. Words for creation often come from roots meaning to reawaken or to rebuild. Theirs was a people of remembering, not beginning. Digging layers support this gut feeling. Beneath the oldest known cities of Sumer, Eridu, Uruk lie still older layers of living spaces washed by ancient dirt. Radiocarbon dates suggest settlements there more than 8,000 years old, coming before the so-called birth of civilization. In some layers, tools appear that should not exist. Advanced metalworking, fine pottery, building exactness. None of it fits neatly within the model of straight progress. Instead, it suggests a broken timeline, an early history erased, then half recovered. Every culture receives its ghosts. For the Sumerians, those ghosts were the gods themselves. The Anunnaki were not worshipped as distant gods, but remembered as teachers, those who had walked among humans before the flood. In hymns, they are called lords of wisdom, builders of cities, those who measured the dark waters. Some modern thinkers have tried to recast them as mythic symbols, mental symbols of knowledge. But in the cuneiform lines, the tone is different. These were recollections, not teaching stories. The Sumerians spoke of them with the language one uses for ancestors, not ideas. In one particularly haunting tablet from Nippur, the scribe records a vision. I saw the stone temples of the deep, their doors sealed by the waters. I saw lights beneath the sea that never fade. Experts translate it as metaphor. But its imagery echoes across mythologies, the sunken realms, the lost cities, the knowledge beneath the waves. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time. The Sumerians simply called it before the flood. Perhaps they were all remembering the same event broken through the lenses of geography and time. Some Earth scientists now suggest that such a flood did indeed happen around 12,000 years ago when ice melt caused huge sea level rise and sank vast coastlines. Entire cultures, if they existed there, would have been erased, leaving only memories passed down through survivors who rebuilt inland. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe have been among them? Could their descendants have carried pieces of that vanished science into Sumer, Egypt, and beyond? The proof is circumstantial, but the pattern continues. Civilization appears not as invention, but as rediscovery. There are objects that seem to confirm this continuity, though most remain debated. In Iraq and Iran, diggers have found drill holes in diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, smooth and exact, as though made by spinning tools. In Egypt, identical markings appear on granite and basalt. The same techniques, the same signatures, separated by thousands of miles. Coincidence perhaps, or memory and ancient technology surviving through pieces of craft. Even language carries traces of this gift. The Sumerian word ti means both life and rib. In their creation myth, woman is made from the rib of the first man, an image that later appears in Genesis. But ti also means to repair. Thus, woman is not a creation but a putting back together, a piece made whole again. The play of meanings reveals the deeper Sumerian view. Life itself is the process of repair, of remembering what was lost. The same principle seems to guide their temples and ziggurats. Each was built as a copy of a heavenly structure, a model of what already existed in the realm of the gods. To build for the Sumerians was to rebuild. Even the measurements of their temples were described as according to the plan written in the stars. It is a line both poetic and exact. For they believed the gods had left the blueprints of the world not on paper but in the sky. If we follow that idea further, it begins to sound less like religion and more like a scientific thinking. What if every discovery humanity makes is not creation but a remembering? Each age in its turn finds a piece, one piece of the greater whole, and believes it new. The Sumerians might have smiled at this illusion, for they saw time not as a straight line, but as a wheel. What was drowned will rise again. The flood did not erase everything. It buried the body of a lost world, but not its bones. Those bones, objects, stories, words still surface, carried by the slow current of time. The question is not whether that earlier world existed, but how much of it we are willing to recognize when we see it reflected in our own. If every piece points towards something greater, some hidden pattern of memory, then how much of our own people is built upon foundations we no longer remember? Every people leaves a trace of its voice. And yet the voice of Sumer stands alone, not connected to any other tongue. Language experts call Sumerian a language isolate, a term that sounds medical. But what it really means is this: it should not exist. Every known language from the ancient Akkadian to the tongues we speak today fits into a family tree. But Sumerian has no family, no known ancestor, no living descendants. It appeared fully formed like its people and vanished just as suddenly. And in that disappearance lies one of the oldest mysteries in human history. When experts first began to figure out cuneiform in the 1800s, they assumed all Mesopotamian tablets were written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon. But as they worked, they found writings whose grammar and structure went against logic. The verbs didn't change like Akkadian ones. The word order was reversed. Words seemed to stick together and break apart without pattern. Eventually, they realized they were reading something far older, a hidden layer beneath the Akkadian texts. They named it Sumerian after the land of Sumer, the first kingdom of recorded time. Yet even after a century of study, no one truly understands where it came from. Language experts have searched for relatives in every direction. The Caucasus, the Indus Valley, the Altaic steppes, even the lost languages of the Mediterranean. None fit. Every guess collapses under the weight of grammar. The language stands outside the great evolutionary web of speech, as if it had been transplanted, complete, alien, ancient. Its structure is unlike any other. Sumerian is a glutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stacking syllables. Each a small code that changes the one before it. A single word can carry an entire sentence's worth of meaning, folding time, number, and emotion into one gesture. For example, the word amitenda means not simply my mother, but the one who is my mother and stands beside me. Every suffix changes the view of relationship and space. It is a language that sees reality as flowing, interconnected, always shifting, more thinking than grammar. Even the word ger 15 meaning Sumerian tongue translates word for word as the true speech or the language of origin. It is as though the people themselves remembered their words as received, not invented. They called writing emi, the voice made permanent. The concept itself is deep. To write was not to record. It was to keep vibration, to trap sound and matter. And perhaps that was why they pressed their words into clay instead of ink, because clay lasts, as if the earth itself were the keeper of their voice. To modern ears, the rhythm of Sumerian sounds almost otherworldly, slow, heavy with breath, filled with stops and harmonies of air. When language experts attempt to speak it out loud, something strange happens. It feels at the same time ancient and new, like a music that does not belong to human mouths. Some have suggested that its structure copies the patterns of Sumerian thought itself, non-straight, relational, circular. The same qualities appear in their art and building. Balance, repetition, reflection. Everything in their world was connected through pattern. What unsettles experts most is how advanced this language system was from its first appearance. There is no proof of its growth from simpler forms. No Proto-Sumerian, no trial writings leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets dating from 3300 BC already use a standardized script steady across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of steadiness means not invention but transmission. Someone taught them how to write. But who? The Sumerians themselves credited their writing to Nisaba, the goddess of wisdom and scribes. She's always shown holding a stylus and a tablet, the tools of knowledge. Yet her name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them writing was not only language but measurement, a way of carving universal order into human form. In that light, their language was sacred technology. Each sign a key to the structure of the universe. When Sumerian eventually faded from daily use around 2000 BC, it did not die. It became a language of the gods used only by priests, space scientists, and experts. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of Sumer, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy objects. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called adubas, young scribes memorized long two-language lists. Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so that the sacred tongue would not be lost. Imagine that. Generations of students working over a language no one spoke, repeating the dead syllables of their ancestors as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do, that something vital lived in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. Even today, attempts to translate Sumerian are haunted by uncertainty. Many words refuse direct match. The same sign can mean mountain, foreign land, or divine home. Their differences blur in the space between metaphor and geography, as if the world and the heavens were still one domain. Some researchers have noticed patterns linking Sumerian sound patterns to math ratios and harmonic intervals. The length of syllables in certain hymns copies musical scales. The spacing of cuneiform wedges follows shape sequences. It is as though language, sound, and number were once unified, a single system of connection that later peoples forgot how to read. The Babylonians turned it into astrology. The Greeks called it philosophy. The modern world calls it science. But the Sumerians had no divisions between them. Their language itself was the bridge. A few daring language experts on the edges of study have proposed that Sumerian might keep traces of a lost language family that existed before the flood. A proto-language from which all later tongues split. If true, then the story of Babel, the myth of one language broken into many, might not be pure teaching story, but distant memory. The idea is tempting that once the world spoke in a single voice and Sumerian was its last echo. When one listens to the rebuilt readings of Sumerian poetry, something stirs in the subconscious. The vowels roll like water. The consonants strike like stone on metal. The hymns to Inanna and Enki sound less like songs than like calls, mathematical prayers to line up the human spirit with the pulse of the universe. The word spoken is the world made. One writing reads, "In their eyes, language did not describe reality. It created it." If this is true, then perhaps what makes Sumerian so strange is not that it came from nowhere, but that it came from everywhere, from a time when speaking and building and remembering were all one act. Its being alone rather than proving uniqueness may instead reveal age. It is a frozen tongue, a surviving shard of the world before words broke into nations and dialects. The silence that followed its disappearance was long. For 2,000 years, no one alive could read it. Yet when the first modern experts began to figure out its signs in the 1800s, they felt something strange, a sense of already seen, as if they were not discovering but remembering. One of them, Henry Rawlinson, wrote in his diary, "This script awakens something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is. The dream language of humanity. A leftover of our first speaking, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist. And yet it does. Quietly going against the logic of history. If the first words ever written were already echoes, then whose voice were the Sumerians remembering when they learned to speak? Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase comes up again and again. Anunnaki. Those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed, and rethought for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not unclear gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of huge power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are written beside the earliest star charts, their symbols buried in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. And though later peoples softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with an unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws directly from Sumerian sources. There they are described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian hymns, their number shifts, sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds, more assorting than account. They live in the heavens, yet come down to the earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, lives in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Absa beneath the earth. Between them moves a group that feels less like a family of gods and more like a council of managers, each assigned a domain, each responsible for keeping the balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so puzzling is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These were not beings to be worshipped blindly. They were respected, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They are shown as powerful but not all-knowing, mortal, perhaps not in body, but in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity are blurred. The Anunnaki do not merely create mankind. They interact with it. They guide, teach, and at times punish. Some of the oldest writings, such as those from the city of Lagash, show these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices that look like wristbands and pouches. They face human figures, teaching them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of guessing. To some, the imagery is symbolic, an artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a word-for-word truth that the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose beginnings lay beyond the earth. The theory is debated, of course. Zecharia Sitchin in the 20th century would make the Anunnaki famous again by understanding their myths as the memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu not just as sky, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued that the Sumerians received knowledge of space science, metalworking, and genetics from these visitors, that humanity itself was a mixed creation. Most experts rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet, even among the critics, the question stayed, why did the Sumerians of all people know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, and the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth Ki the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a space body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Sitchin's planetary theories hold, the language fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind that crossing was divine movement, the coming down of the watchers. But even if we strip away modern guessing, something unusual remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Ilu, the divine watcher who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered religion. The watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They did not rule from afar. They documented. Humanity in their eyes was a trial worth keeping in record. One hymn from Ua calls them those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that comes down with them lighting the earth. Experts translate these passages symbolically as thunder, as lightning. Yet the repetition of light, coming down, and observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word Jira, translated as divine flame, was also used to mean metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they could not fully name. The play between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not word-for-word visitors, but the showing of universal order. The planets themselves, the forces of nature given personality. Enki, lord of the deep, copies the watery abyss. Enlil, lord of air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave family trees, treaties, and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns. The lords have left. The houses are silent. Their voices are gone from the wind. The tone is not mythic. It is historical, almost documentary. It is the sadness of a people remembering the pulling back of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings made into myth over time, their deeds made bigger into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost people, lifted by respect into godhood. But there is another possibility, quieter, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they could not explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlived Sumer. The idea of sky beings who came down to teach humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Netjer, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of the Devas coming down from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna, who came from the stars to teach writing and time. All different names, all carrying the same pattern. Beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event broken through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki were not just their gods. They were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say kingship came down once more from the heavens. But the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we're remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both. For the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. If the watchers truly came from the sky once before, then what are we seeing when we look upward tonight? The light of distant suns or the reflections of those who promised to return? Long after the voices of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes carried northward to Akkad, to Babylon, to the rising towers that tried once again to reach the sky. Peoples remembered and misremembered the bond that had once existed between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called it Duku, the holy mound, the meeting place of gods and men. The Babylonians gave it another name, Ziggurat, the mountain built by hands. But the story that survived through scripture, through exile and translation, would call it something else, the Tower of Babel. To understand that myth is to understand the moment when language and perhaps even history broke. The book of Genesis tells it simply. Humanity speaking one tongue sought to build a tower that may reach unto heaven. But the Lord confused their speech, scattered them across the earth, and ended their unity. It is a story of divine punishment for human pride. Yet behind its moral shadow lies a deeper, older memory, one the Sumerians knew well. They too wrote of a tower that touched the heavens. A ziggurat whose top was said to join the stars. They too told of confusion of tongues, of cities left empty, of gods who turned away. In Babylon, that tower had a name, Enigmatic, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in the heart of the city, massive and layered, built of fired brick and bitumen, climbing 7 stages like the planets themselves. Each level was painted a different color. Black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the sun. It was not merely a temple. It was a map of the universe, a stairway of connection between the visible and the invisible. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it in the 6th century BC, he carved upon its walls, "I raised the summit to the heavens so that its top might rival the heavens themselves." But even he, King of Kings, knew the weakness of that ambition, for every tower built to reach the sky carries within it the seed of its fall. The Sumerians had watched their own ziggurats crumble before, eaten by floods, by fire, by silence. They knew that no structure could put back what was lost, the direct talking between man and the divine. That bridge had been broken. And yet, humanity could not stop building. Perhaps we were not going against the heavens. Perhaps we were trying to remember them. When the later priests of Babylon repeated the tale of Babel, they did so not as a warning, but as sad song. The confusion of languages was not punishment. It was tragedy. Once they said, all words were one as were all hearts. The gods and humans could speak without veil. Then came the scattering, the breaking of unity into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 myths, each remembering only a piece of the whole. It was the day when meaning itself divided. Diggers digging the site of ancient Babylon in the early 20th century uncovered the foundations of a massive ziggurat near the old temple of Marduk. The base alone measured nearly 100 meters across. The bricks still bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Above the ruins, heat wavers in the desert air. And if one stands very still, it is possible to imagine the tower that once rose there, a mountain of clay and fire pointing toward the sky that once seemed close enough to touch. The tower is more than building. It is symbol. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was a place of coming down, not going up. A structure that allowed the gods to come down to earth. Its top was a landing place, its stairways the path of the stars. The very word ziggurat means to be raised up. But not in the human sense. It was the gods who came down, the watchers who crossed the line between heaven and earth. Somewhere between that coming down and the later story of Babel, the meaning flipped. Humanity became the one climbing, reaching, grasping. And when we reached too high, silence answered. It is a silence that still haunts us. The disappearance of the Sumerian language, the loss of its knowledge, the ruin of its towers, all feel like showings of that same ancient break. The bridge was never rebuilt. What came afterward, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, were attempts to translate a forgotten word. Every language since then has been in a way a Tower of Babel, an effort to touch the divine through sound, to recover the original vibration that once united speech and creation. In the myth, the punishment is confusion. But perhaps confusion was the only way humanity could survive. the single language of the gods, once broken, scattered like seeds across the earth. Each piece grew into a different tongue, a different way of seeing. The unity was lost, but diversity was born. And still within each language, echoes of the first remain. The same basic words for sky, for water, for breath, the same rhythm in prayer and poetry, the same longing for reunion. The Sumerians may have understood this long before Babel. Their god Enki, the trickster and savior of humankind, was also the master of language. One myth describes him giving many tongues upon the nations so that no people would be without song. In this version, the division of speech is not a curse, but a gift, a necessary scattering that keeps creation alive. Perhaps they knew that unity without difference is silence, and that to speak truly is to be plural. Still, the image of the tower lasts, rising again in every age. It rises in the pyramids, in the cathedrals, in the radio towers that now pierce the sky. Each is a new attempt to bridge the distance between what we are and what we once were. Each carries the same question, whether spoken in Sumerian, in Hebrew, or in the binary pulse of modern machines. Can we ever speak again with the voice of the heavens? In the ruins of Babylon, pieces of that longing still remain. Travelers have described hearing strange sounds in the ziggurat's base, an echo that makes even a whisper bigger. It is as if the structure itself remembers its purpose, still carrying sound upward, still searching for a reply. The silence that followed Babel was never total. It was the beginning of listening. Some say the story of the tower warns against ambition. Others believe it teaches humility. But perhaps it teaches neither. Perhaps it is simply a record of loss. The moment when knowledge turned to language and language began to fail. The divine pulled back, leaving humanity with words, with memory, with the endless desire to rebuild. And maybe the greatest irony is this. Every time we tell the story of the tower, we rebuild it. With each retelling, each translation, each voice seeking to name the unnameable, the tower rises once more in the realm of sound. And as it rises, so too does the old silence waiting. We are still living in the aftermath of that silence, the echo of Babel that shaped all history. And sometimes late at night, when the world is still and words begin to blur, one can almost hear what lies beneath the noise, the faint whisper of the single language, still speaking from the dust of forgotten towers. If the gods once walked down the steps of our towers to speak with us, what would they say now when we can no longer remember the sound of their voices? After the fall of Sumer, when the ziggurats turned to ruins and the stars no longer spoke to the cities below, the keepers of knowledge did not vanish. They pulled back into temples, into script, into secrecy. The priests of Babylon and later of Chaldea became the caretakers of what remained, the pieces of the ancient me, the divine formulas of civilization. If Sumer had once sung its knowledge openly to the heavens, the world that followed whispered it in chambers of stone. What had been a language of gods became a code of men. In those dark hallways, the scribes and priests space scientists performed the same rituals their ancestors had performed for thousands of years. The watching of stars, the recording of eclipses, the calculation of omens. But their purpose had changed. Where once observation had meant talking, now it meant keeping. The universe no longer spoke clearly. The priests understood its silence through symbols. Each sign on a tablet became a shield against forgetting. The temples of Babylon were not merely houses of worship. They were labs of continuity. In the Asagila, the temple of Marduk, priests mapped the heavens night after night, tracing the positions of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They listed eclipses, storms, and signs, writing them into thousands of tablets. It is from these records that the later science of space science and even astrology was born. Yet behind the calculations lay an older belief that the sky was not a machine but a message. Every motion of a planet was a word in a divine language, and only those who knew the code could read it. These priests called Baru and Ashipu were trained not merely in ritual but in mathematics, medicine, and prayer. Their schooling could last decades. They learned the sacred shape of the temples, the ratios of the human body, the harmonic intervals used in chants. Knowledge was not split up. It was total. A single organism whose organs were number, sound, and spirit. To heal a wound, one spoke a number. To measure a star, one sang its name. Each act was part of a code that linked heaven, earth, and the human soul. Even the rituals of exorcism, later made fun of as superstition, carried traces of skilled understanding. The priests would draw circles, triangles, and spirals in ash, shape patterns that copy the harmonic frequencies of sound waves. They burned herbs whose chemical properties are now known to purify air. They used bronze bowls carved with math formulas that when struck produced resonant tones. Every movement, every sound, every gesture was calibrated. The ceremony was not mere theater. It was coded interaction with the universe. And yet, as centuries passed, that knowledge grew heavier, harder to bear. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians conquered Babylon, then the Persians, then the Greeks. Each new power demanded the service of the temple priests, but cared little for their belief systems. The sacred texts were copied, rethought, hidden. Some were sealed in clay jars. Others were buried beneath temple floors, written in myth. What could not be kept was changed, transferred into story. Thus the old sciences survive disguised as legends waiting for a world capable of reading them again. There are tablets that record the priest's sad song for this age of hiding. One piece from the Chaldean oracles reads, "The word has been divided. The code has been sealed. Only the initiated may open the gate." The gate in their symbolism was not a door but a line of understanding, a bridge between ordinary language and the divine structure beneath it. To cross that line required both thinking and purity, logic and respect. Knowledge, they believed, could not be given to those unprepared to hold it, for misuse would unmake the world. In the later centuries, Greek travelers who visited Babylon wrote of a strange priesthood that spoke in riddles and numbers. Pythagoras, it is said, spent years among them, learning the mathematics of the heavens. The Chaldeans taught that the soul was a spark of the stars, that its return to the divine depended on understanding the shape of creation. Their teachings would pass into Greece, into Egypt, into the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, then into the alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. The code of Sumer, hidden through ages, would continue to breathe beneath the surface of Western thought. Some pieces of those old texts survive. One tablet describes the writing of light said to be used by the gods to carve the laws of the universe. Another speaks of the song that binds the firmament. The modern reader may dismiss these as poetry, but the priests meant something word for word. They believed that light and sound were two expressions of the same vibration, that the universe was written in resonance, and in that belief lies the seed of what modern physics would one day rediscover, that matter itself is structured energy patterned by frequency. To guard such knowledge was both privilege and burden. The priests lived apart, forbidden to speak freely of their craft. The Baru, the diviners, often wrote their tablets in riddling word order, using metaphors that only the initiated could decode. They spoke of lions when they meant storms, of serpents when they meant rivers, of chariots when they meant planets. Even the stars themselves were given secret names. Mulmul for the Pleiades, Nibiru for the crossing planet, Utu for the sun. To outsiders, the language was myth. To those who knew, it was instruction. Yet secrecy has a cost. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BC, he ordered the translation of all temple collections into Greek. Most were misunderstood. Many were lost. The surviving Chaldean priests pulled back into Persia, Syria, and eventually into being unknown. By the 1st century BC, the last of them, known as the Magi, had transformed into figures of legend, keepers of half-remembered wisdom. Some would say they followed a star to Bethlehem. Others that they vanished into the mountains of the east, carrying with them the last keys of the code. Still, echoes of their system lasted. Astrology, often made fun of as superstition, is the faint reflection of their space mathematics. The shape of sacred building from the pyramids to cathedrals carries their ratios. Even our words magic, matrix, measure came from their vocabulary of harmony. What began in Sumer as divine calculation became over time the grammar of civilization itself. But there is a certain sadness in this survival. For the priests who guarded the code knew that knowledge once broken from its sacred context loses part of its soul. The formulas survive but the meaning fades. The rituals remain but the resonance weakens. Humanity remembers the method, not the mystery. Sometimes late at night when telescopes point at the same stars those priests once charted, one can imagine their ghostly presence. Watchers in silence, measuring light, translating infinity into numbers. They would recognize our instruments perhaps, but not our faith. To them, the universe was not a cold machine, but a living manuscript written by a hand both human and divine. We have figured out their code but forgotten their respect. We have learned the symbols but not the silence between them. If the priests once guarded the bridge between knowledge and meaning, who guards it now? When the code lies open, but the world has forgotten what it was written for. History, they say, is written by the victors. But before it is written, it is rewritten, and perhaps no age rewrote the past as completely as the empires that followed the fall of Babylon. The Greeks and later the Romans did not merely conquer the ancient world. They reorganized its memory. They took the scattered pieces of Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge, stripped them of their mythic voices and rebuilt them into a story that began conveniently with themselves. It was the greatest act of cultural alchemy ever performed, the transformation of living memory into history. And in that transformation, time itself was changed. By the time Alexander's armies crossed the Tigris, the temples of Sumer had already fallen silent. The last priest space scientists of Babylon were aging, their libraries neglected, their languages fading. The conquerors found not gods but ruins. Yet within those ruins were clay tablets. Hundreds of thousands of them, each carrying a voice from a world that refused to die. The Greeks, practical and curious, collected them, though they could not yet read them. What they did instead was something more subtle. They absorbed the ideas, the measurements, the pieces of space science, and gave them new names. Sumerian mathematics became Greek geometry. Chaldean star charts became Hellenic space science. The ancient calendars were reshaped into the Julian one, adjusted to fit imperial time. And just like that, the memory of the first people became a prelude, a footnote, an echo. But buried beneath that act of taking lies a paradox. The Greeks themselves knew their knowledge was borrowed. In their own writings, they confessed it. Herodotus wrote that the priests of Babylon possessed wisdom of the heavens beyond measure. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Thales credited their belief system to travels in the East. Plato's Timaeus describes an Egyptian priest telling Solon, "You Greeks are children. You have no old men among you." He meant memory. The empires of the Mediterranean were receivers of pieces they barely understood. And yet, through translation, through adaptation, they claimed ownership. It is here that time begins to warp. Before the Greeks, history was circular. The Sumerians saw eras as tides eternally returning. Creation, flood, putting back, decay, and creation again. The Egyptians called these ages Zep Tepi, the first times. The Chaldeans called them Sar. Each cycle ruled by a different constellation. But the Greeks introduced a new concept. Straight time. A line that begins and ends, moving always forward. Progress, invention, destiny. Ideas that made sense to conquerors. The past became a distant origin, not a living mirror. And thus, the empire rewrote not only history, but the very structure of time itself. With that new timeline came erasure. The gods of the Sumerians became teaching stories, their kings myths, their cities swallowed by sand. The old language was dismissed as barbarous, its meaning reduced to superstition. To keep order, the conquerors made official a beginning, an origin point that placed themselves at the center of civilization. Greek philosophy became the root of wisdom. Rome became the axis of power. Everything before them became before history. And just like that, the age of the Anunnaki, the flood, and the clay collections dissolved into fable. This rewriting was not merely political. It was spiritual. The Roman Church, receiving Greek rationalism and imperial authority, later made official a straight record of divine creation and human salvation. The circular universe became a one-way pilgrimage from Eden to judgment. The sacred wheel of time flattened into a divine timeline. By the Middle Ages, the only acceptable history was sacred history. What lay outside its borders was called heresy, myth, or sin. And yet, Pieces of the old world continued to seep through the cracks. Astrological texts survived, disguised as Christian prophecy. Alchemical diagrams hid Mesopotamian symbology beneath Latin scripture. Even the image of the ziggurat continued, reimagined as the biblical Babel. The empire could rewrite the words, but not the shape of the memory itself. Memory is stubborn. It resists conquest. When the Renaissance dawned, experts began rediscovering the ancient Near East through trade and travel. Greek texts mentioning Babylon and Chaldea led explorers back toward the forgotten lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But when they arrived, they found only desert and dust. The physical ruins of Sumer were gone, buried beneath thousands of years of sediment. For nearly 2,000 years, the first people remained invisible, its very name erased. The empire had succeeded, at least for a time. It was not until the 1800s, when British and French diggers began to dig up Mesopotamia, that the silence finally cracked. When the first Sumerian tablets were dug up at Ur and Nippur, the world realized that history was far older than it had been taught to believe. Humanity's timeline extended backward, not by centuries, but by thousands of years. The so-called cradle of civilization shifted east, and the empire's record began to tremble. But even then, the rewriting continued, only now in more subtle form. Modern history absorbed Sumer the same way the Greeks had as forerunner, not equal. The Sumerians became proto-scientists, early engineers, early space scientists. Their gods were made into myths, their mathematics made simple. The old worldview, a universe alive with consciousness, was again filtered through the rational lens of progress. The empire's logic of straightness remained intact. We received not the Sumerians' sense of eternal return, but the conqueror's timeline of advancement. Perhaps this is the true legacy of conquest, not the destruction of peoples, but the rearrangement of their memory. The empires that rose after Sumer learned to control not only land and people, but time itself. They mastered record as a tool of power. To name the beginning is to define the present. To erase the past is to own the future. And yet the past refuses to stay buried. The Sumerian king list with its impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years mocks our sense of record. Their myths of circular floods challenge our straight lines. Their language, still only half figured out, resists final translation, as if guarding secrets too old for our straight minds. Every empire eventually becomes a layer in someone else's digging. The Greeks, the Romans, the Church, the modern world. We all participate in the same cycle of rewriting. Perhaps we're no different from the scribes of Babylon, copying old tablets, changing a few lines to make them fit our time. Civilization, like clay, can be reshaped, but never beyond recognition. The fingerprints remain. If one looks closely at the ruins of any empire, the same pattern appears. Order built upon erasure, light cast upon selective shadows. And beneath those layers, faint but continuing, the memory of Sumer lasts. It waits in the wedge marks of cuneiform, in the myths that survive translation, in the buried rhythm of our calendars and clocks. The empire may have rewritten time, but time in its own quiet way rewrites empires. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The conquerors who declared themselves the beginning are now objects in museums, while the Sumerian clay, the very medium they dismissed as early, still lasts. The tablets outlasted marble, gold, and parchment. They still whisper through the dust. We were here first. If every empire must rewrite time to rule it, then who in the end will rewrite ours? The story of Sumer should have ended with the dust. Yet somehow across 5,000 years, it found its way back into the light. Translated, digitized, shown in glowing pixels on screens that flicker like oil lamps in the dark. Clay and code, two forms of permanence born from opposite ends of history. And as the world of machines learns to read the marks of ancient hands, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the tablets were always meant to return, whether their shape of wedges was itself an early form of programming, an echo of logic rediscovered in another age. When the first cuneiform tablets were dug up in the 1800s, they appeared still mere curiosities of digging. But as experts began to figure them out, the strangeness grew. The Sumerians wrote in data, not stories, inventories, algorithms of trade, space tables, and even if then conditionals carved in clay. One tablet from Nippur reads like an early computer program. If the star of Jupiter rises in the east, then the harvest shall be great. Others record shape series, square roots, and number systems so advanced that they would not be fully understood until modern mathematics rediscovered them. The clay was memory. The stylus was instruction. It is no exaggeration to say that every modern collection, every database, every algorithm is a direct descendant of the Sumerian tablet. The act of pressing meaning into a medium that lasts beyond its maker began there. Yet what they kept was not merely information, but purpose. Their symbols were designed to last through disaster. Fire would not destroy them. Water would only harden them. Perhaps they had already seen what happens when the world floods and memory drowns. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that next time something, anything, would survive. In the cold light of museums, those tablets appear ancient. But when their contents are written into digital text, they read with startling modernity. Lists of professions, wages, contracts, codes of rules, equations, maps of the stars. The Sumerians lived in systems, networks of exchange and observation. And when one looks at them closely, the lines between their world and ours begin to blur. The ziggurat becomes a server farm. The scribe's stylus becomes a keyboard. The same impulse drives both. The desire to record, to calculate, to build meaning from pattern. But there is a deeper resonance, one that hums beneath the surface of all technology. In Sumerian mythology, creation itself was described as writing. The god Enki carved the laws of existence onto the tablets of destiny. These tablets decided the fates of men, the movements of stars, even the rise and fall of kings. Whoever had them could rewrite reality. The myth may sound remote, but its logic is familiar. We too live in a world where code governs existence, where lines of digital instruction decide life, commerce, and war. Our machines are the new tablets of destiny. Our programmers the modern scribes. The medium has changed, but the principle remains. Those who control the code shape the world. It is tempting to believe that progress separates us from the ancients. But what if it only circles back? The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform repeated across thousands of years may be the earliest expression of binary logic on or off, presence or absence, impression or void. Each mark was an encoded decision, a unit of meaning stored within a grid. The tablets are not objects of the early past. They are prototypes of the digital mind. In 2021, scientists used machine learning to translate damaged Sumerian tablets. Algorithms filled in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. The program achieved remarkable accuracy. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again. A feedback loop across 5,000 years. Humans teaching machines to read what humans once wrote by hand in the dawn of civilization. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps that continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed that knowledge moves in cycles. What is lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases and the scribes rebuild. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old, the reappearance of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. In one of the oldest surviving hymns, the poet addresses Nisaba, goddess of writing and calculation. Lady of the counting house, keeper of the tablet, the numbers of the stars are your servants. To her, the act of computation was divine, not mechanical. The same could be said of us, though we no longer admit it. Every search query, every data set, every machine translation is a ritual of calling, a plea to the algorithms that now hold our shared memory. The priests of data, like the priests of Enki, whisper to their servers in languages few understand. We may call it progress, but the rhythm feels familiar. It is worth remembering that the Sumerians never separated writing from sacredness. To them, words were living forces able to bind or free. Even the dead could be reached through writing. Some tablets were buried with the departed, messages for the underworld. Others were sealed in temple walls addressed to distant generations. To the one who finds this, one writing reads, "Know that we too sought the truth of heaven." That message pressed into clay 5,000 years ago might as well have been written for us. The machines that surround us today hum with the same longing to keep, to predict, to extend consciousness beyond its mortal frame. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation, but perhaps it is an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse to make something that remembers when we are gone. And yet there is danger in memory without understanding. The priests of Babylon warned that the tablets of destiny must never fall into unworthy hands. Once Enki himself lost control of them, and chaos followed. Rivers reversed, the heavens dimmed. It took all the gods to restore the order of creation. In our age, we too hold tablets of destiny, the codes that regulate life, knowledge, and power. But do we still remember the respect those first scribes carried? Or have we mistaken the act of recording for the act of wisdom itself? Perhaps this is what the Sumerian story has always tried to tell us, that knowledge is not progress without memory, and that every technology, no matter how advanced, must answer to the silence from which it came. The clay tablets survived 5,000 years because they were humble, because their creators understood impermanence. They wrote not to dominate, but to last. The machines we build now are louder, faster, more brilliant, but perhaps less wise. For in their speed they forget the slowness of the stylus, the weight of wet clay, the patience of hands that wrote for forever. We have learned to keep everything except the quiet, and in that quiet, perhaps the old gods still wait. If the first tablets could survive the flood of water, can our new ones survive the flood of information? And what will they remember of us when the next world begins again? History is a fragile thing, and yet it lasts in the most unexpected places, in the grooves of stone, in the rhythm of myth, in the faint tremor of a name whispered through time. Peoples rise and collapse. Empires rewrite the story. Yet some memories refuse to die. They float beneath the surface, sleeping, but alive, waiting for the world to remember again. The story of Sumer is one such memory, a pulse that continues to beat beneath the skin of our modern world. Quiet but insistent, like the echo of something that never truly left. When the first Sumerian tablets were translated, they were treated as curiosities, their religion dismissed, their kings reduced to myth. But over time, a pattern began to appear. A sense that these pieces were not simply ancient texts, but the opening chapters of the human mind. The Sumerians were not a lost people. They were the memory of civilization itself. Everything that came after law, space science, building, language, measurement, was already contained within their clay. We have merely been rewriting their story in new alphabets. Even now, their traces linger in the most ordinary corners of life. Every time a clock divides an hour into 60 minutes, the base 60 of Sumer ticks onward. Every map of the stars still follows the constellations they charted, the zodiac, the calendar, the shape of the circle. These are not Greek inventions but Sumerian gifts. We live by their mathematics, dream in their belief system, and speak through metaphors they first carved. The clay may have hardened, but the memory moves. And yet, it is not just the inventions that survive. It is the worldview behind them. The Sumerians believed that all creation was bound by relationship, that heaven and earth, matter and spirit were part of the same breath. The divine was not distant but interwoven with the physical. To build a temple was to echo the universe. To write a word was to copy the act of creation. In their myths, even the gods were subject to laws of balance and give and take. They did not rule as tyrants but participated in a living order. That idea, though buried beneath thousands of years of religion and empire, has never truly vanished. It resurfaces whenever humanity rediscovers the unity of science and spirit. Whenever we sense that knowledge without respect is incomplete. There is something haunting about the way the Sumerians saw time. They did not measure it as a straight line moving from past to future. They felt it as a cycle of remembering and renewal. The flood was not an ending but a turning. The loss of knowledge was never permanent. Every age they believed would rediscover the wisdom of the one before. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian legacy keeps returning through digging, through language, through myth, refusing to remain buried. The cycle turns again. In the 21st century, the ancient words of Sumer are once more being read, not by priests or scribes, but by digital collectors and algorithms. Thousands of clay tablets have been scanned, decoded, and stored in virtual libraries that circle the Earth in orbiting satellites. The same human impulse that once pressed styluses into wet clay now encodes data into light. We are, in a strange sense, continuing their work. The tablets have become servers. The gods of the Abzu, the deep, have become the networks that pulse beneath our oceans. The old metaphors have found new machines. But something of the Sumerian spirit still lingers in our technological faith. Like them, we build collections to outlast us. Like them, we write in hope of surviving the flood. Ours no longer of water, but of data and forgetting. Every digital message, every line of code, every photograph kept on invisible clouds is a modern cuneiform, a mark against disappearing. And perhaps deep down we share the same fear that one day silence will return and only the language of the machines will remember us. In their time the Sumerians feared that their gods would pull back, that the connection between heaven and earth would fade. Today we fear the opposite, that our own creations will outlive us and that what we have made will speak a language we no longer understand. Yet both fears spring from the same source, the awareness that memory has a life of its own. Once written, it cannot be unmade. The words outlast the writer. The record outlives the soul. Somewhere perhaps that is what the Sumerians intended. Their myths end not with triumph but with continuity, with the sense that even when the gods depart, their traces remain in the dust in the rivers in the eyes of those who still look upward. The gods have gone, one late Babylonian scribe wrote, but their breath still moves in the air. That breath is memory itself, unseen, unceasing. Diggers continue to uncover new tablets every year. Some hold contracts, others hymns, others pieces of stories that seem strangely modern. One tablet speaks of a man who loses his purpose in a world of excess. Another of a woman who goes against divine decree to speak her truth. Their emotions are ours. Their longing is ours. The more we translate, the more the distance collapses. We realize that 5,000 years are not a gap, but a circle returning to its beginning. There are nights when the desert still reveals its secrets. After storms, the wind shifts the sand and a piece of clay surfaces. Another piece of the story rejoining the light. To touch such a piece is to touch both the beginning and the end of history. Its markings, once a code of empire, now look like the patterns of microchips and circuits. The similarity feels accidental, yet something within it whispers otherwise. Perhaps the universe repeats its designs, sculpting the same logic in clay and in silicon, in hands and in algorithms. The Sumerians believed that the world was born from the mingling of memory and matter, the Abzu, the deep waters giving rise to form. And so it seems fitting that their story should end as it began, not in silence, but in return. Their cities are gone, their names forgotten by most, but their breath moves still in the languages we speak, the numbers we count, the stars we map, and the stories we tell. Maybe that is the secret they left hidden beneath the dust. That no people ever truly dies. It only transforms, passing its soul forward in symbols, waiting to be reawakened. The clay of Sumer became the circuitry of our age, and through it the old gods still whisper, no longer from temples, but from the quiet hum of data centers, from the pulse of screens in the dark, from the endless stream of words that cross the world each night. The memory has learned to survive every flood. It will survive this one too. And when our towers crumble, when our languages fade, when our machines fall silent, perhaps someone or something will dig through the ruins of our world, find our tablets, and begin to read. If memory can never die, then perhaps forgetting is only an illusion, and every end merely the beginning of remembering.